He didn't flinch. Not once. A decorated general sat before the American Senate, speaking in measured tones, dressed in his polished uniform, shoulder stripes gleaming under the fluorescent lights of power. But behind that confident voice was a lie. And it wasn't the deception that hurt most, it was something deeper. Something that made Ibrahim Traoré stop mid-sentence when he first heard the testimony. Because the man speaking against his country was black. This wasn't just a political betrayal, Traoré would later say. It was personal. Burkina Faso had been accused, again. Accused of channeling gold to fund a military regime. Accused of corruption, of collusion, of fueling instability. But the story the general gave wasn't just factually wrong, it was morally devastating. He claimed Burkina Faso had gold reserves long before the current government. That they were misusing it. That they were aligning themselves with the wrong forces. What he failed to mention, or perhaps what he deliberately ignored, was the truth. Burkina Faso never had a gold reserve system before Traoré's administration. In fact, it was under his leadership that the country began storing its wealth, instead of exporting it for pennies. But facts, it seems, matter little when power wants a villain. And to make it worse, they found someone who looked like the people they wanted to vilify. A man whose skin matched those of the very villagers in Burkina's north, still burying sons lost to foreign-fueled terror. That was the true wound. Not the accusation, not the lies, but the symbolism. Another black man sent to discredit a black revolution, sent to fracture the very solidarity that once held a continent together. The betrayal struck harder because it was familiar. It was history repeating itself in real time. Traoré had seen this play out in films, politics, and colonized classrooms. Black soldiers led into wars they didn't start. Black spokesmen echoing scripts they didn't write. Black hands lifting the chains while pretending they were keys. And now, a black general, uniformed, polished, prepared, standing on the wrong side of a battle for dignity. Traoré didn't call for war. He didn't curse the man. Instead, he asked for something more damning in its power: truth. If he was misled, let him say so, Traoré declared. If he made a mistake, let him tell the Senate. And if it was intentional, then we will confront him, because everything he said requires a response. And yet there was no retraction, no clarification, only silence. To the world, this might have looked like another geopolitical spat, but to those who understand the weight of skin in a war for sovereignty, it was something else. It was a message. Even your own can be used against you, and that's what made it so dangerous. But here's what the general didn't know. This wasn't the Burkina of old. And Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just another African leader waiting for permission to defend his people. This was the start of something else. Something they weren't prepared for. Something they could no longer control, and that lie would echo farther than the general ever imagined. Before Ibrahim Traoré stepped into office, there was no gold reserve in Burkina Faso. Not a single bar stored in the national treasury. The country, rich in minerals yet chained by economic dependency, had been exporting its lifeblood to foreign interests for decades. Multinational companies swooped in under the pretense of partnership, digging deep into the soil and deeper into the country's sovereignty. All that gold, raw, pure, and buried beneath the feet of the Burkinabe, was leaving the country faster than roads could be built or children could be fed. That was the starting point. That was the truth no one wanted to talk about. Until Traoré came in, the new administration didn't just take office, it declared economic war on the status quo. One of their boldest moves: begin stockpiling gold inside Burkina's own borders, not for luxury, not for image, but for survival, for sovereignty, for the dream that one day the country could stand on its own feet without stretching its hands toward Paris or Washington. But the moment Burkina Faso stopped exporting all its gold and instead started building its own reserves, headlines changed. Suddenly, the very act of saving was labeled suspicious. Western analysts, media outlets, and political operatives began spinning a new story: that Burkina's government was hoarding gold for a shadowy purpose, that it was potentially funding terrorism, that the gold wasn't going into the hands of the people, but into bunkers for warlords. The same voices that never once criticized decades of wealth extraction were now crying foul the minute Burkina dared keep its own gold. "It is lies," Traoré said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "And it is disgraceful to see an adult lie, a general officer from a large army lying like that." The accusation didn't just sting because it was untrue. It stung because it came from a figure draped in authority, a figure meant to be objective, a black man, no less, echoing the language of empire. This wasn't new. It was a familiar ghost. Africa's gold has always had a price, but rarely has that price been set by Africans themselves. During colonial rule, European powers mapped the continent not by geography but by what could be extracted. Rubber in the Congo, cocoa in Ghana, diamonds in Sierra Leone, uranium in Niger. Gold was among the most precious, and it always flowed. One way, out. The body stayed, the blood dried, the gold left. So when the West accuses an African country of hoarding its own gold, it's not about legality, it's about control, about who gets to say what a nation can or cannot do with its own resources. The narrative isn't designed to expose corruption, it's designed to prevent independence. "They said we were hoarding gold for terrorists," Traoré said. "No, we were hoarding it so our children wouldn't starve." That line didn't trend. It didn't make international headlines. But in Burkina Faso, it hit like a thunderclap. Because people there knew the truth. They had watched trucks leave in the dead of night, hauling away the wealth their hands dug up but never touched. They had seen contracts written in French, legalese that signed away their minerals for generations. They knew what it meant when their leaders said, "Enough." And so, when the general stood before the U.S. Senate, claiming that Burkina Faso's gold reserves predated Traoré's government, that they were simply being misused, it wasn't just wrong. It was a calculated distortion, a misinformation weapon, fired not from a gun, but from a podium. The problem with lies like these is that they don't float harmlessly in the air. They land on people, on perceptions. They fuel sanctions, justifications, covert operations. They reinforce the belief that African nations cannot govern themselves responsibly, that even when they try, it must be questioned, inspected, reported, and if they resist, they must be punished. It's the same story dressed in digital clothing. During the colonial era, false narratives were printed in newspapers and telegrams. Today, they trend on Twitter, get echoed on CNN, rephrased by think tanks, and echoed back into the halls of Congress. The goal remains the same: shape global opinion to justify intervention. One lie leads to surveillance, another leads to sanctions, a third leads to military support. And all of it, every policy, every drone, every embargo is quietly funded by the minerals beneath Africa's soil. Burkina Faso wasn't just fighting terrorism on the ground. It was fighting a propaganda war in the skies above it, a war against the idea that African gold must always leave Africa, that African leaders must always bow, that black generals can only rise by speaking their master's script. That's what made this general's betrayal so painful, not just because he was wrong, not just because he was powerful, but because he was, in the eyes of the world, one of us. A black man weaponized to delegitimize black resistance. Traoré didn't need to say it explicitly. The message was already in the air. You don't need white gloves to carry out imperial policy. Sometimes the hand that crushes you looks just like yours. And so, the ghost of empire moved again, through microphones, through suits, through polished smiles and scripted testimony. But something had changed this time. The people listening weren't just diplomats and investors. They were youth on smartphones in Ouagadougou, farmers in villages who had started seeing roads, clinics, and tractors for the first time. Soldiers on the front lines who knew what that gold was really funding: body armor, boots, training, and a fighting chance. They weren't fooled. And Traoré? He didn't blink. If this general was misled, he said, let him say so publicly. If he made a mistake, ask the Senate to correct him. But if this was deliberate, then let them know we will respond. That wasn't a threat. It was a promise, because the war for Africa's gold is no longer just about mines and markets. It's about narrative. It's about who gets to define truth. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the most dangerous weapon in an empire's arsenal is the lie that says you can't lead yourselves. But that lie is cracking. And in Burkina Faso, with every ounce of gold now buried for its people, not for its masters, the empire is learning. The ghosts it once commanded no longer obey. The tanks moved like iron beasts across Red Square, their treads humming history. Overhead jets screamed symbols into the Moscow sky. And on the ground stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, focused, not just watching a parade, but witnessing a memory. The memory of a people who once faced the impossible and chose to fight anyway. It wasn't just a celebration of Russia's victory in World War II. For Traoré, it was something deeper. It was a mirror, a reflection of his own struggle back home. They lost 27 million souls, he said, later. And yet, they stood. They bled. But they stood. There was a tremor in his voice. Not weakness, but reverence. This wasn't the kind of history found in textbooks or foreign policy briefings. This was blood and bone memory. The kind that binds one people's pain to another's. Because Traoré didn't come to Moscow to admire military displays. He came to draw strength, to learn, to honor, and in a way to remember what Africa was forced to forget. During World War II, African men were ripped from their homes and shipped across continents to fight for European powers. From Senegal, Niger, Mali, and yes, Burkina Faso, then Upper Volta, they were told it was for liberation. They were handed rifles, thrown into trenches, and told to die in wars they didn't start. But there were no medals waiting, no parades, no pensions. Instead, they returned to find empty promises, and in many cases, an early grave. In Senegal, when veterans demanded their pay after the war, they were gunned down. Their blood stained the very soil they had once been told they were protecting. Their loyalty meant nothing. Their skin, to those they served, was still black, disposable, and if they dared demand justice, they were slaughtered. But it didn't stop there. In Belgium's Congo, colonial officers didn't just exploit, they dehumanized. Africans were caged like animals in traveling exhibitions across Europe. Black skin displayed beside gorillas and tigers. The message was brutal and clear. You are not one of us. And in the name of control, horror found new depths. In some cases, men were castrated, yes, physically mutilated to prevent them from reproducing. Their lineage severed, their dignity shattered. In one horrific revelation, researchers discovered that rubber plantations in Congo once dried sap on the bare skin of black workers because cardboard was deemed too expensive. Imagine that. Human skin, cheaper than packaging. This was the real war, the one that never ended. So when Traoré watched Russian soldiers march in unison, young and old, proud and battle-hardened, he didn't see foreigners. He saw ghosts of his own people. Men who had stood in the same mud, bled under the same sky, and returned to silence. And in the resilience of the Russian people, he saw a blueprint for survival. They could have signed an armistice, he said. They could have said enough, but they didn't. They fought, for years. And they won. Burkina Faso today faces a war of its own. Not against a foreign invader in uniform, but against faceless terror. Against militias funded by unknown hands, against shadows with weapons fueled by outside interests. For over a decade, Burkinabe soldiers, many of them barely old enough to remember peace, have fought in the dust, the heat, the fear. Villages have burned, families shattered, markets turned into graveyards. But like Russia once did, Burkina refuses to kneel. It's not that there haven't been deaths. Traoré admits, the weight of loss heavy in his tone. There have been many. too many. But we do not give up, because we know we will win. That belief isn't naive. It's ancestral, rooted in the understanding that freedom isn't granted, it's seized. That sovereignty doesn't arrive with aid packages. It's carved out, often painfully, from the jaws of imperial agendas. And in this fight, Burkina has found an unlikely ally: Russia. Not the Russia of Cold War chessboards or economic sanctions, but a Russia that understands the price of survival. A Russia that, too, is being rebranded in the media machine of the West as a threat to order. The same media that once praised colonial officers and painted African revolutionaries as radicals. Traoré doesn't shy from this alignment. He doesn't apologize. He calls it what it is: strategic. Russia provides military equipment. Yes, but more than that, it provides military education. Russian forces are training Burkina Faso troops in modern combat tactics, intelligence, and strategy. This isn't a handout, it's a handshake, a mutual agreement. No strings, no lectures, no democracy workshops. And more importantly, Russia supports Burkina's vision of developing its own defense industry. We don't want to rely on imports forever, Traoré explains. We want to build, innovate, train our youth, produce weapons, yes, but also engineers, scientists, architects of our own future. This is where the idea of multipolarity becomes more than a buzzword. It becomes a weapon of resistance. For centuries, the world was told to revolve around one sun, the West, one narrative, one economy, one language of power. Everyone else? Satellites, subjects, spectators. But a multipolar world breaks that model. It suggests that other centers of gravity can and should exist, that Africa can align with whomever it chooses, that Russia can stand with Burkina. That sovereignty is not a sin but a right. And for those in Washington or Paris who see this as betrayal, Traoré has a simple answer. We will go where we are respected, where we are treated as equals, not where we are lectured like children, while our resources are stolen. Because this isn't about ideology, it's about survival. As he stood in Moscow, the drums of the parade echoing through the square, Traoré wasn't dreaming of war. He was remembering one that never truly ended. The war for dignity, the war against historical erasure, the war to make sure Africa no longer bleeds so others may live. Burkina Faso isn't just marching beside Russia out of convenience. It's marching beside a country that knows what it means to bury millions and rise again. A country that remembers what it's like to be isolated, vilified, and still survive. That's solidarity, that's strategy, and maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of a new chapter in the African story. One where Black soldiers are no longer cannon fodder, where Black leaders aren't apologizing for thinking differently, where nations like Burkina don't just resist, they rebuild. Because if 27 million could die, and Russia could still rise, then what might happen when Africa finally fights for itself on its own terms and wins? The answer isn't in the past, it's marching toward us. And it won't be alone. They tried to isolate him. They thought sanctions and slander would break his back, that by cutting off power, banking access, and foreign aid, they could force him to crawl back to the table like every leader before him. They were wrong. Burkina Faso did not kneel. And neither did its president. Ibrahim Traoré now finds himself at the heart of a continental storm. But he doesn't run. He doesn't sleep. Quite literally, he doesn't sleep. If I could once rest for 2 hours, he said quietly in an interview, now I allow myself only one. That's not bravado. That's burden. The weight of millions, youth across Africa, who see him not as a politician, but as a symbol. A living signal that maybe, just maybe, Africa can finally wake up from a 400-year sleep. But with awakening comes retaliation. The so-called brother states, those aligned with ECOWAS and the West, moved first. When Burkina Faso cut ties, they didn't respond with dialogue. They responded with darkness. Power grids were cut. Hospitals lost electricity. Sick children died under flickering lights. Banks were frozen. Families couldn't send or receive money. Villagers couldn't buy bread. Mothers couldn't get medicine. It was punishment, plain and brutal. And it was betrayal. "How do you call yourself a brother?" Traoré asked. "If your first reaction is to suffocate us." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. These were coordinated economic attacks disguised as diplomatic pressure. But behind the curtain, the game was clear. If Burkina Faso succeeds on its own, if it proves an African nation can survive and thrive without Western dependency, then the whole system cracks. Then others might follow. And for the old power brokers, that's the real threat. So they moved swiftly, with tools more silent than tanks, but just as deadly. Burkina Faso responded not with retaliation, but resilience. In the wake of isolation, Traoré turned to alliance. The AES, an emerging coalition of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rose like a phoenix from the ashes of ECOWAS. 3 nations, united not just by shared language or geography, but by a common refusal to be pawns any longer. "We don't want to be ruled by puppets," one Burkinabe youth shouted at a recent rally. "We want real leaders. We want Traoré." To understand the fire behind that voice, you have to understand the silence that came before it. For decades, African youth were fed a quiet diet of managed expectations. They were told to study, obey, wait. Change would come. Development would arrive. But all that came was debt, dependency, and disillusionment. Leaders grew rich while villages stayed poor. Ministers flew first class while schools collapsed. The only thing that grew was the list of foreign bases and foreign debts. Then came Thomas Sankara, and for a moment, hope. He spoke of revolution, with a child's clarity and a soldier's certainty. But they killed him. They erased him. Or so they thought. Because in Ibrahim Traoré, many now see the ghost of Sankara returned, not in words alone, but in action. Farmers now have their land plowed for free. Health centers are rising across the country, fully equipped, accessible, dignified. National gold is being saved, not stolen, and jobs, real jobs, are being created through local industry, not foreign NGOs. But progress paints a target, and Traoré knows it. He walks with urgency, not ego. His voice is calm but never soft. And when asked about the growing pressure, he doesn't flinch. "They said I was too young," he said once, looking directly into the camera. "But if I must bleed for this land, I will." That moment, raw, unscripted, exploded across African social media like wildfire. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight. You could feel the decades behind them, the unspoken pain of being overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. But this time, the youth were watching. Not the UN, not Washington, not Brussels. The youth. And they were no longer asleep. All across Africa, something is shifting. In dorm rooms, street corners, refugee camps, and cyber cafes, young Africans are rewriting the script. They're questioning the headlines, fact-checking the experts. They're building apps, podcasts, platforms. Because the media war is the new front line. For too long, Western media has monopolized the narrative. They've framed coups as chaos, resistance as rebellion, sovereignty as instability. They've painted Traoré as a radical, a populist, a dangerous voice. But they don't live here. They don't feel the heat. They don't bury the dead when another village is struck by foreign-funded terror. And they never ask, who armed the terrorists? Who funded them? Who benefits when Africa stays in crisis? Traoré does, and he's naming names. They aren't terrorists, he says. They're criminals, armed by the imperialists to keep us weak, to keep us begging. That's not conspiracy, it's clarity. And now, African media must match that clarity, not with propaganda, but with truth, with local languages, with platforms that don't censor, twist, or silence. Because in the age of information, control no longer comes through guns, it comes through algorithms. Traoré knows this too. And he's not just building an army, he's building a consciousness. A collective awakening, one that teaches Burkinabe children that their gold belongs to them, that their flag stands for something, that their leaders answer to the people, not to Paris. The stakes are no longer theoretical. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about a continent on the brink of reclaiming itself. And that scares the old world, because what happens if this generation no longer kneels? What happens if Africa stops looking west for answers and looks inward instead? What happens when young Africans stop asking for permission? We're about to find out. And as the drums beat louder in Ouagadougou, as the electricity flickers but the spirit burns bright, one thing is certain: the youth are watching, and this time they will not kneel. The accusations were loud, slick headlines, rehearsed testimonies. A decorated general standing before the American Senate, declaring that Burkina Faso's gold was being funneled into chaos. He called the new leadership dangerous, said the reserves were a front, that the gold belonged to the people and Traoré had stolen it. But he forgot something. Before Ibrahim Traoré, there was no national gold reserve. No vaults, no vision, just extraction, decades of it straight into foreign hands. Traoré didn't hoard gold. He protected it. From the very people who'd been looting Africa for centuries. That's why he spoke out. Not out of pride. Out of duty. Because the lie wasn't just against him, it was against a people, a continent, a history. And worse, the messenger was one of their own. A black man, speaking the language of the colonizer, doing their work with a darker face. And that was the wound that cut deepest. They want to use our skin to enslave us, Traoré said, but we see them now. The media won't repeat that quote. They'll edit it out, blur it in translation, frame it as radical. Because in this war, cameras are weapons, headlines are airstrikes, and truth is the first casualty. They don't want people to know Burkina Faso is building clinics, not bunkers. They don't want the world to see the free fields being plowed, the schools being rebuilt, the soldiers being trained with pride and purpose. Because if they saw that, if they saw what Traoré is actually doing, then the whole narrative falls apart, and that's dangerous, not for Africa, but for those who built their empires on its knees. So Traoré doesn't beg for understanding. He demands accountability. If the general was deceived, he said, let him say so publicly. If he was misled, let him stand before the same cameras and admit the mistake. And if it was deliberate, we will meet him in full truth. Because this time we're not playing the role they wrote for us. He doesn't just want retraction, he wants reckoning. This isn't just about Burkina Faso, he continued. This is about every African nation that dares to say no more. And mark my words, Burkina will become the tomb of imperialism. That line didn't trend either. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, in cafes in Bamako, and in refugee camps stretching across the Sahel, it's already an anthem. And still, this is just the beginning. The next moves, what alliances will form, what walls will fall, what truths will be weaponized, are coming. What happens next will change everything.